Welcome to the Veritas Podcast. I'm Scott Veritas here with my co-host Ben Rebellis, and we are going to talk about the death of Jordan Neely. Today, you've probably seen video of or commentary about the death of Jordan Neely. Jordan Neely was a 30-year-old homeless man in New York City. He went onto a subway car, I believe on May 1st, or maybe it was April 30th. It was about 5 or 6 days ago. We're recording today's episode on Sunday, May 7th, and it should be released probably on Tuesday the 9th. So there might be a couple of things that have changed by then. But in any case, just to give you guys a basic idea, if you don't know, Jordan Neely went onto a subway car. He started behaving erratically, according to witness statements. He started making threatening statements. He said something to the effect of, and I'll try to make this as close to a direct quote as I can. As I recall, he said, according to witness statements, something to the effect of, "I don't have any food. I don't have any water. I'm fed up." And then he proceeded to say, "I will hurt anyone on this train. I do not mind going to jail, and I'm ready to die." And that's going to be pretty close to, I'd read this statement multiple times. I wasn't reading it just now, but that's pretty close to what the witness statements say he shouted when he went onto the train. And then a witness also said that he took off a jacket he was wearing and threw it onto the ground. Another thing to know about Neely going into this is he has a kind of interesting background insofar that he was apparently a fairly recognizable kind of homeless menace in this part of Manhattan. A lot of people are now anonymously reporting, and you might want to take it with a grain of salt because some of this stuff comes down to just posts on Reddit and Twitter. But there have been an awful lot of posts from people in that part of New York saying that they've encountered this particular man before and that he's behaved erratically, violently, or in an intimidating fashion. And Neely has been arrested 42 times for various crimes, some of which he was convicted of, including kidnapping a 7-year-old girl that he was caught dragging down the street, assaulting a 67-year-old woman that he punched in the eye, and assaulting a 64-year-old man that he punched in the head. Now, the other person in this story who ends up putting Neely in a chokehold right after he throws his jacket on the ground may or may not have been aware of the kind of things that Neely was up to in his past. We don't know that yet, and that's information that we're probably going to find out in the near future. But the part of the story that was caught on video and that you're all probably hearing about most is that right after Neely makes these sort of maybe slightly ambiguous threats to the passengers on the train, throws his jacket on the ground, he's put in a chokehold by a 24-year-old Marine named Daniel Penny, whose name was released, actually, I think, by the Marine Corps just a few days ago. And he dies. He dies while in a chokehold by Penny. There have been a few different reports of exactly how long he was put in a chokehold for. Some have been as long as 15 minutes, but I think that's been brought under dispute. It's not 100% confirmed exactly how long he was in a chokehold. The video of Penny putting Neely in a chokehold is like 3 or 4 minutes long. Another thing that I'll mention before I throw it over to Ben for some analysis is that if you watch the video, you'll see that not only is Penny putting Neely in a chokehold, but there's 2 other men on the subway train helping to subdue him. Of course, this story is tinged with racial politics, so I have to mention that Penny is white. I think one of the other men restraining Neely is also white, but one of them is black. Neely himself is black. So this story has been a pretty big deal for the past few days. There are protests that seem somewhat localized to New York. They're fairly unruly protests bordering on riot, unrest, whatever you want to call it, because people are standing in subway tracks, preventing, they're blocking roads, they're blocking subways, they're keeping trains from operating. There's videos of people yelling at and harassing police officers. Nothing that rises to the level of what we saw in 2020 with George Floyd, and it seems more localized to New York. But this is sort of bubbling into one of those situations where it could become, the next big Black Lives Matter cause celebre. There's a lot more to the story in terms of Neely's background and how he's being portrayed by the media, how Penny is being portrayed, video that has resurfaced of Neely because he was not only a fairly recognizable homeless menace, but apparently a fairly recognizable Michael Jackson impersonator. This story is tinged with all sorts of sort of weird twists and turns. But before I go any further, Ben, as the sort of, I always call you our resident legal expert.
Right.
I'm curious to know from your perspective what you think of the legal aspects of this story. As of the time of recording, Daniel Penny hasn't been charged with a crime. I think it's all but certain that he will be charged with a crime. I don't know what crime, but some kind of crime. And also, I'd be interested to hear from you just kind of on the moral and philosophical aspects of it, because what we're going to talk about a lot on the show today is how I would sort of brand this for the purposes of today's discussion as being a climactic scene in a story that has unfolded over the course of the past 3 years about crime, homelessness, and disorder in America's cities. What are your thoughts, Ben, on both sort of the legal and moral and political facets of this story?
Yeah, we'll start with the legal. One quick thing. You mentioned that Penny's name was released by the Marines. I actually think it was released by his own attorneys. They made it. I think the attorneys outed his name, and they had a statement saying, and I can't remember.
So that was probably a Twitter rumor.
Yeah. So legally, it gets a little messy when you start talking about homicide-related crimes, because so many states talk about them very differently. Like, people hear the term first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, reckless homicide. They're all defined differently by the different states. I don't know how New York does it. I'm going to just kind of use common law general terms. But so this is almost certainly not a murder, which is the knowing or intentional killing of a human being. There's no evidence I've seen that Daniel Penny set out to kill this person. The highest charge I think you could maybe get to is voluntary manslaughter, which typically is a killing in sudden heat. I think that's probably also a stretch here because of the lack of intentionality, but you could maybe throw that charge. The most likely thing, and what I think he will be charged with, is some variant of involuntary manslaughter / reckless homicide. And again, states define that very differently. That's probably where the state will settle. I think they have a really tough case because most people, and I don't think you'll disagree with me, think that the initial physical encounter after he said, Neely says that I'm going to be getting a life sentence. I think anybody sees that as a violent threat of murder. I mean, that's the only crime you can get a life sentence for. So I think a lot of people would think that some type of physical intervention here was justified, which means that the state's going to have to make the case that at some point in this however minutes long encounter, Penny's intent went from being justified to being criminally reckless. That's a pretty tough case to make. There's a way to do that. So let's say that Neely goes limp after 90 seconds of being restrained, but Penny keeps on the pressure for like another 10 minutes. Okay, we can see that's pretty. But once we start adjusting those dials and getting those times closer to each other and what they perceived at the time, I think that's a really a tough prosecution to make. But Alvin Bragg is willing to do some tough prosecutions that can be somewhat legally baseless. So I was listening to Michael Moynihan on the Fifth Column talking about this, and the guys on that show are like lifetime New Yorkers. And one question he brought up, I thought is a really interesting point, is before we knew this guy's name, he's like, he wondered if Penny was a New Yorker or not. Because if he was from out of town, behaviors that are normalized in those contexts are very different than if you come from a rural or suburban area. Like, you and I both live in a major city. I think that's fair to say without adding us too much. Like, I walk past people asking for money or randomly shouting. That's not an infrequent occurrence for me. My parents, who live in a rural area, would, they may be shocked or scared. I mean, they're not isolated, but their reaction is going to be different than mine. So I think that's a really interesting concept of how much does it matter that those of us who live in cities have come to normalize this behavior? What does that say, do you think, about the reasonableness of Penny's reaction here?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's been pointed out about this multiple times, and that I wanted to mention earlier, is that typically, I mean, as you were saying, we both live in major cities. I often have to take the subway where I live. And unfortunately, people have become very stone-faced and stoic about homeless, erratic and disorderly behavior by homeless people on the trains, even threatening behavior by homeless people on the trains. Everyone will just kind of sit there and hope that it doesn't become too much of an issue. If it becomes really scary, they might move to another car. And that's kind of the last resort. In this case, you not only had someone who felt threatened enough to to engage in defensive violence, but you have two other people that felt the need to help restrain this person. That's really unusual right now in America's cities. Most people are pretty cowed and pretty demoralized about this thing. And this is where I think you can slot in a conversation about just what American cities have been put through for the past 3 years during a pretty unprecedented crime wave, at least for my lifetime. I was born in 1995. So when I was born, the crime wave of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s was starting to recede. And the first, 25 years of my life up until 2020 were spent during a time of pretty much unprecedented safety in America's cities, or at least until about 2015, actually, as I understand it. I think crime was ticking up a bit between 2015 and 2020. And so I think that the question of whether or not he was from New York is an interesting point. And I haven't looked into that, but there is now this question, as you said, on the legal aspect of the story of, I don't think any honest observer is going to claim that the initial putting Neely in a chokehold was felonious, illegal in any way. I mean, it just can't be read that way. Because, I mean, I guess I'll say this. I said any honest observer. But what we have right now is a bevy of dishonest observers, if you will, on Twitter, in the woke orthodoxy, who are basically saying that it is American civilians' job, it is our job to sit silently and put up with any amount of disorder and criminality and threatening and intimidating behavior by homeless people, because to enact any kind of use of force on them is immoral. And you have many people trying to, of course, also change the narrative around who Neely was. Neely is an unambiguously bad person. And I know that's getting into, philosophy more so than the legality of the situation. But this is a guy who had been convicted of kidnapping a 7-year-old child, spent 4 months in jail for that one, which, by the way, I didn't know you could spend less than several years in jail for kidnapping a child.
I think he attempted to, and then they pled it down to exploitation, endangering a child, but still 4 months for trying to steal a 7-year-old is bad.
Yeah, he was. God only knows what he was intending to do with this 7-year-old girl, but he was dragging her down the street and he got arrested for it and convicted of a crime, spent 4 months in jail for it. He broke the orbital bone of a 67-year-old woman. I mean, he had an open warrant for an assault on, I think, an elderly man as well. He was an unambiguously bad person, and the attempt to portray him as sort of like a starving artist almost, because there's all this footage of him from his time as a Michael Jackson impersonator, sort of busking on the streets of New York. Nothing inherently wrong with that. I appreciate if you ever go to New York, you'll see people doing this sort of thing. On a subway car, it might be considered more kind of antisocial behavior because that's a secluded space, but in the streets of New York, it's a very normal thing to see. But people are taking all this video that exists of him performing as Michael Jackson on the streets of New York and saying, look at this, happy, jovial figure just trying to spread the joy of Michael Jackson's music. Of course, leaving aside the fact that Michael Jackson is an accused pedophile and whose reputation is murky at best at this point. But there's also something that got brought into this story I don't want to leave out of our conversation because it's probably one of the weirder turns that the story has taken. There was a video circulating on Twitter. I do want to mention this, and I'll play devil's advocate a little bit, as I like to try and do on the show. There's a video of the Howard Stern show's Joey Boots having an encounter with Neely, I think circa 2013, maybe 10 years ago. Neely would have been a much younger man at this point. He was 30 at the time of his death a few days ago, so he probably would have been around 20, around college age. People were juxtaposing this encounter that he'd had that was filmed by Joey Boots, where they were juxtaposing it with another famous encounter that Joey Boots had with Tucker Carlson. Some of you may have seen a video on Twitter. It's an interesting video. You should look it up if you haven't yet, of Joey Boots encountering Tucker Carlson while he's fly fishing, while Carlson is fly fishing. And Carlson famously in this video has a very sort of cordial and nice little conversation with Boots after some initial discomfort with the fact that he's being filmed. And it's been used as an example of Tucker Carlson just being an all-around kind of nice guy or whatever by people who are fans of his. It's a cool video, but it's been juxtaposed now of this video of Joey Boots' encounter with Neely, circa 2013. Now, in the video of Joey Boots confronting Jordan Neely, Neely is doing one of his Michael Jackson impersonation routines on the streets of New York. Joey Boots comes up to him and starts harassing him about the fact that Michael Jackson is an accused pedophile and has been for many decades. the video is edited selectively on Twitter so that most of what you see is Neely after he's been harassed by Boots for several minutes, and he snaps and he starts slapping Boots around and punching him in the chest. And Boots, of course, starts saying, "I'll call the cops. I'll call the cops." If you're familiar with the work of Joey Boots or the Howard Stern show, this was a thing where this guy would just go around and just piss people off in New York, film them very invasively, even though it wasn't a public space, and he would often be assaulted or you know verbally screamed at or whatever. This video has been juxtaposed with the Carlson video to try and be proof of Neely's lack of character or his violent nature. I really want to caution people against using this particular piece of video. And I kind of have no doubt that, Ben, if you've watched have you watched that whole video? Yeah.
I watched, the whole thing. This idea of harassing street performers is just I thought the whole thing was really gross.
Yeah. The thing about the video that I just want to make sure people understand, and I want to say this pretty emphatically on the show, this is really not a good thing to be sharing if you're trying to paint this picture of Jordan Neely as like a violent, schizo homeless person. The video in question, if you watch it in its entirety, not the selectively edited version that was circulating on Twitter, juxtaposed with Tucker Carlson, if you watch it in its entirety, it's several minutes of Joey Boots clearly playing the antagonist in the video, harassing Jordan Neely, telling him that he's impersonating a pedophile. Jordan Neely tells him to get the fuck away from him. I wouldn't say he necessarily tries to diffuse the situation, but he tries to solve it with his words. And
he does walk away.
He does walk away at one point, and Joey Boots continues to harass him for several minutes. And eventually, Joey Boots gets slapped around because this is, it's New York City. You're harassing a street performer for several minutes, aggressively filming them. It's a weird thing where it was a very popular, almost kind of viral clip that was circulating on Twitter. And I just want to tell people, I don't think that should really be used in the story if you're coming from the perspective of Jordan Neely being some kind of violent schizo homeless guy. Now, of course, you can look at Jordan Neely's criminal record and then you've got what you need if you're trying to make that case. But that particular video was very, I could tell that it was selectively edited when I was watching it because I'm slightly familiar with Joey Boots's style of call it documentary filmmaking, if you will. And so I really would caution viewers against retweeting and sharing that video because it's very selectively edited. It seemed to be going around quite a lot. But in any case, the truth about Neely, though, is that it is not hard to portray him as a violent person. He has a long criminal record. It's so predictable at this point that he would be painted in such a sympathetic light, but it's so shameless. I mean, it's so bizarre. In the case of George Floyd a few years ago, and this case is inevitably going to be compared to that, Floyd had robbed a pregnant woman at gunpoint, I think maybe 10 or 15 years prior to his death. Also a pretty unambiguously evil thing to do, but there was a little bit more time separation, I think, there. Mm-hmm. In this case, Neely's crimes were as recently as like a year or two ago.
Oh, yeah.
In some cases. So yeah, it's just been really, it's I guess I wouldn't say it's bizarre because it's so predictable at this point, but it's demoralizing and annoying to see the media always immediately jump to, like, no matter how backed into a corner we are based on the facts, we're going to portray a black victim of interracial violence as a sympathetic figure. And in this case, it is probably one of the worst cases of propaganda I've ever seen.
Yeah, the word I was using and thinking of is maddening. That watching the narrative creation machine work is maddening. I mean, the media decided who was the victim, who was the aggressor, and it was the sweet but troubled Michael Jackson impersonator against the violent, racist former Marine. And there's no evidence at all really to support that narrative. I mean, there is some evidence that Neely had been visited by social workers. He had been to Bellevue, I believe is the name of the hospital. But I, first of all, have seen no diagnosis. I mean, I think it's hard for me to doubt that he had suffered a huge trauma in his life when his mother was killed when he was like 14, I believe. But beyond that, everyone is just going straight to, this is a mental health narrative, this is a race narrative. But that he might have had some mental health problems does not justify the complete fabrication. This is a textbook example of how our media works to sow division between warring factions of the culture war. Not everything that happens has to be part of the culture war. Things can just happen, but everybody has to perform. Everyone has to have their take that is beyond one killed another one on the subway. It has to be about self-defense and the decline of American cities on the right. It has to be about mental health and racism on the left. Maybe it has nothing to do with that. I think that's probably not true. I think there's a lot going on in here. I'm not saying it's the right way to look at it, but this instinct to put every situation in a box is it's maddening. I did want to contrast, and I want to say I half predicted this a few weeks ago. The contrast of the reaction here to the Nashville shooting by the trans person. And I said, isn't it amazing how the left in that case was quick to say, well, this has nothing to do with gender ideology. This has nothing, like we need to put the brakes on and we need to get the evidence before we start making any conclusions of this type. Not 24 hours after this Jordan Neely thing was the race narrative developed by our media, by our politicians. And it's just gross. And the other kind of interesting thing is if you're going to take a mental health aspect, what about the fact that Penny was a former Marine? Now, I don't know if he saw combat. I didn't see any reports that he did, but where's the PTSD? America has a mental health problem relative to his, trauma, quote unquote, to the extent that he even had any from being in the military. Like, you see all these different narratives that could be creative, but the one that you just knew was going to happen was the one that immediately did, and it is maddening.
Yeah. Well, the narrative machine demands that people deny the experiences that they've been having. Anyone who's lived in a city for the past several years knows exactly what happened here. You have encounters with homeless people that are uncomfortable, and then you have encounters with homeless people that are downright frightening if you live in an American city right now and you're regularly leaving your apartment, which I hope you are, not just being a shut-in. And the narrative machine is asking people to basically say that disorder is okay if a marginalized, quote unquote, marginalized person is the source of the disorder. And we get into this uncomfortable tension between what we're being told is a need for sympathy, sympathy and compassion that we're supposed to have for people, and the need for accountability. And this is something we've talked about before on the show, which is that we need to be in an accountability culture. Well, a lot of the problems we face, including the problems with crime right now all across America's cities, are because of a lack of accountability. The most obvious case is that there's a lack of accountability for criminals themselves, especially when those people happen to be homeless or if they belong to some kind of ethnic minority group, generally Black people. They're sort of treated with kid gloves. There's district attorneys all across the country that are not properly sentencing people for violent crimes. They can be arrested 40 times. They can be convicted 10 times of violent crimes. And the fact of the matter is, if somebody commits, there used to be 3 strike laws. Do you think the kind of person that gets a second chance after committing a violent crime and then gets one more chance after that is going to stop at number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7? Unfortunately, the reality, and I know it's not an easy pill to swallow, the reality is something like 2% of the American population is responsible for, like, I don't know, it's like 70% of the crime. It's like, and this isn't your 1355 thing. I'm not talking about Black people. I'm talking about, it is usually poor Black young men, often with maybe unresolved mental trauma or issues. And that's the part that we're asked to focus in on, is the sympathy and compassion we're supposed to have for people because they're poor, because they're mentally ill. But that's putting the cart before the horse. The thing about this issue that pisses me off is we do not have time. We do not have the time or resources when we are under attack by violent criminals all across the nation who are running rampant. We do not have time to think in the long term about people's unresolved mental issues, or, the fact that they come from living in poverty. It's such a great example of putting the cart before the horse. It's like, how can you focus on that when the obvious solution in the short term is to enforce the goddamn law? And it's something that we did for 25 years to great effect, or at least 20 years, from 1995 to 2015, the first 20 years of my life, we lived through an unprecedented time of urban safety all across the nation, with a few, exceptions like Baltimore and Detroit. You always had your cities that you knew, hey, be careful when you're there. Most very large cities like New York, Chicago, you knew that you were generally going to be pretty safe. This story, there's also an element of like vigilantism, and you could compare it to the famous 1984 subway shooting case of Bernard Goetz, who I don't know if you're familiar with this case, Ben, but it was a guy who he shot 3 black teenagers who tried to rob him with screwdrivers on the train. He ended up being convicted of, I think, an unrelated firearms charge, which was kind of funny. But he got acquitted of murder in all 3 cases. And this became kind of a rallying cry for some degree of vigilantism and anti-crime policy in New York City. This case is different from that, but it's being compared to that in many ways. I think that this case is an interesting one to talk about outside of the context of just comparing it to George Floyd, I guess is what I mean to say in saying all this. And I think it could be a little bit more comparable to, say, the Rittenhouse case. I think that's probably a better thing to compare it to. But the thing that makes it interesting when compared to even the Rittenhouse case is I don't think the facts as they stand now are as flattering to Penny's defense as they were to Rittenhouse's defense.
I agree.
He's in a much better situation than a former police officer, Derek Chauvin, was when he was accused of murder, but not not as much as Rittenhouse. But anyway, there was a lot there. Ben, I know you probably want to jump in here.
Yeah. So I kind of like and we've talked about is accountability culture, and I like to think of it as, personal accountability culture. I mean, this is what libertarians, classical liberals have been saying for a long time, is if people are personally accountable and responsible, we do not need the overbearing hand of the state to take care of ourselves and our loved ones. The problems arise when people are not accountable, when they're not responsible. So take something like this is I've always had really tough times, if I go like strict, like anarcho-capitalists, like really pulling the libertarian, Murray Rothbard strings. You take raising children, for example. They're helpless, they're vulnerable. And when their parents don't provide for them, they're neglectful or even abusive, we then create a situation where we need an institution like the state to come in. And then once that's established, the nature of the state is such that it is always trying to increase its territory and scope. And then we end up with these flabby behemoth institutions that can't really even provide the original service effectively that they were intended to provide. And we've seen example after example of failed institutions that follow that pattern, which could be fixed with accountability. Now, I'm not a fan of the carceral state, obviously. I think that, victimless crimes, we shouldn't be putting people in prison, although the statistics that are out there, even from people on my side, of how many people are actually in prison for purely victimless crimes are entirely overblown. Most people are in prison because they are violent criminals. And I would like to hear the solution to that problem. If it is not the carceral state, if it is not putting people in prison, like there are those on the left that talk about restorative justice, what we need to do is get victims and offenders together to, I don't know, have a powwow. Listen, there are unrepentant criminals out there. There are unrepentant child molesters out there. Some of the comments I have heard, people who rape children say that they will continue to do so. Those people exist, and a meeting with their victims is not going to do anything to fix that. So I want to hear what the solution is, because nobody is happy with the idea that a person that is violent because they're a paranoid schizophrenic is in prison. Nobody likes that outcome. I want to know what the solution is, if it is not keeping other people safe by institutionalizing them in a prison.
I think what it comes down to for me, as I think about this issue, is that society cannot exist without outsiders, without, frankly, losers, people who lose according to the rules of the system. And to expand on this idea and maybe make it a little bit clearer, there have to be people who are looked at as the bottom of the hierarchy. And in society, if you were to do that based off of race or class, then you're getting into the sort of fascist or racist or white supremacist stuff. What I'm talking about is people's behavior. If a person, regardless of their race or their class, engages in violent behavior, which is the worst possible thing you could do. It's the number one rule in civilized society is no violence. Unless it's in direct self-defense, no violence. It's the number one, and that includes sexual violence. It's the number one rule. There are some other rules, but the first thing you teach your kids if you have a child is, hey, don't hit people unless they hit you first. Don't do that. You just don't. You just don't. Even if they're being mean, even if they're being really mean, maybe with some exceptions, like, yeah, someone's really bullying the shit out of your kid, you might be like, all right, maybe you beat them up a little bit. But with some very small exceptions, this is the first pillar of civilized society. There are many pillars, but the first and biggest one is no violence. And I feel like We're being asked by the woke orthodoxy to say, hey, nobody can lose. Nobody can go to jail. Nobody can be held accountable because that's racist or it's immoral or whatever, because it ends up skewing along, sure, racial and class lines. It does end up skewing that way. And a conversation about why it ends up skewing that way is an interesting enough conversation to have. But step one is to accept that there have to be losers. There have to be people who end up in jail. There have to be people who end up in jail for most of their lives. And those people are going to be people who cannot be helped. And I know this is controversial, even in the kind of IDW, anti-woke space that maybe I occupy as a commentator. I know this is controversial, but I truly believe there is a small percentage of the population that, whether it's because of nature or nurture, because of something that was loose when they were born, or because of the circumstances of their life, they're psychopathic. They're beyond help. They cannot conceive any degree of empathy for their victims. They just can't. And if we don't label them as, hey, we kind of have to put them in the ash heap of society. We have to throw them in jail and put them in jail and throw away the key. We have to go El Salvador on their asses, is what I've been saying lately, because you might have seen clips coming out of the government of El Salvador that they've been taking gang members, almost all of whom are convicted murderers, because these are El Salvadorian gangsters. They are not your grandma's gangsters. They've been taking gang members in El Salvador, locking them up, warehousing them between massive prison units, and they've been smashing their graves with sledgehammers. I mean, they really have declared them enemy combatants. And guess what? The murder rate in El Salvador, formerly the highest in the world, has been reduced by 50% in 2 years. So is it brutal? Is it ugly? Yes, I would never deny that. But my attitude towards these issues at this point is, we have to identify people who border on enemy combatants. And yes, everybody's got their constitutional rights. Everybody's got their right to a trial. Nobody should go to jail without a trial, 100%. But we do have to identify the percentage of the population. It's a very small percent that is committing almost all of the violent crime, and go El Salvador on their asses to some degree, because guess what? It will solve the problem. It did it in the mid-90s and throughout the mid-2000s. Stop and frisk, for whatever you want to say about how racially tinged it was, it reduced crime in New York City by a lot. And there's an interesting conversation to be had about how you avoid overt racism and unnecessary racial profiling in the process of doing these things. Because you can't just, of course, I'm not saying you should treat every black person in cities across America as a potential criminal and racially profile them. That's not the point of what I'm saying. But once you have evidence of anyone being a repeat violent offender, and it gets past the second or third or fourth chance, you have to basically put them on a list of what Hillary Clinton once referred to as super predators. People who are just beyond the context of get them a social worker, put them in therapy. That's clearly not the answer for a small percentage of the population.
The social worker thing is always one that really drives me crazy. I've interviewed a lot of police officers, that I work in criminal law, so that's part of the game. And, they have dangerous jobs. And the idea that you're going to take an untrained, unarmed person that's going to fix almost any situation that's gotten to the point where there needs to be state intervention is it's truly absurd, especially when you see, and I'm going to denigrate a large class of people here, especially when you see the quality of some of these social workers. They're not people I would trust to de-escalate almost any situation. They're just not highly qualified people, and they don't have to be. Like, it's a tough job. I sympathize, but the ones I've met, for the most part, are not the most impressive people. The point I'm taking from what you just mentioned, Scott, is it would be interesting to live in a world if we could identify who those people are, this very small percentage, before they committed violence against people. Like, there's always, like, I think Sam Harris kind of has this. Yeah, Sam Harris kind of has this thought experiment of, like, if we could develop a pill that would make someone not be a psychopath, we would obviously want that pill to exist and for people to take it. So it's that's an interesting thought experiment. Like, is there going to come a day where we could use fMRIs or some other kind of technology to be able to figure these types of things out on the front end? Until then, they're unfortunately going to be victims of violent crime. But when we identify these people who are not going to be rehabilitated from not using drugs, from theft is bad, but even that is from hurting others senselessly for no good reason. I am for every enhancement for violent criminals, because violence like violence like what Neely had done to a 67-year-old woman is unacceptable, and that person should not be on the streets. And whether they're not on the streets because they're mentally ill, which again, I think the evidence is a bit thin here for that, or because they are a habitual violent criminal, is actually irrelevant to me.
Yeah. Well, and there's always this attempt to conflate violent criminals with, again, there's this always this somewhat mythical nonviolent offender. And yes, there are nonviolent offenders, some of whom may be in prison, some of whom may be in prison for longer than they should be. But as you were saying before, Ben, most of the people who are in jail for decades at a time, for years at a time, are there because there was some element of violence to their crime. And we're always asked to, every single one of these violent criminals is always framed as if they're like the most sympathetic possible portrait. There's sort of this spectrum that we have to think about when we're thinking about criminals, from most sympathetic to least. So on the least sympathetic, you'd have like an adult person who's a child molester and torturer of a serial killer, essentially. And on the most sympathetic end of the spectrum, you'd have like a 12-year-old who stole a bag of chips from a grocery store because his single mom is addicted to heroin and his siblings were hungry. And we're always kind of asked to conflate these two things. Like there's always, the conversation always seems to be hypothetically about that most sympathetic possible portrait, because no one in their right mind, including me, and I'm certain including Ben, would ever want the 12-year-old who stole a bag of chips because his siblings were hungry to go to jail. No one would ever want that. No one would ever want that kid. You might not even have to put a kid like that in handcuffs. Like, it's just, you would be as sympathetic as you possibly could and connect him to resources like maybe a social worker that could help him. Sure, but we're not talking about that. This is what drives me crazy about this conversation. No one is talking about that 12-year-old kid whose siblings are hungry. No one is talking about that. We are exclusively talking about what Hillary Clinton once referred to as super predators, repeat violent offenders, not 2 times, not 3 times. We're talking 15, 16, 17, 20, 30, 40 convictions for violent offenses who are getting let out onto the streets. I remember seeing a clip out of New York City where, Alvin Bragg is the DA and he'll be in charge of this case with Jordan Neely. It said, it was a black male who punched an Asian woman. This has become a kind of a little bit of an all too common phenomenon in New York City, these sort of black on Asian hate crimes. And it said, the suspect was out on bond for rape. And I was like, for rape? You can be out on bail for that? Like, I was like, it's just crazy how these sympathetic solutions to crime and these sympathetic reactions to crime are being conflated between people that you might hypothetically be sympathetic towards. Your kid who's hungry and steals food from the grocery store, which is not a very common crime, I have to be frank. People do not steal a lot of groceries. They steal a lot of sneakers and Xboxes. But hypothetically, there's probably people who do steal groceries. And of course, we're sympathetic to that because how could you not be? But I guess I'll put it this way. It's disingenuous. People know that's not what the conversation is about. And there's a group of people in the woke orthodoxy who disingenuously try to conflate these, just like they conflate protesters with rioters, just like they conflate, everyday normal LGBT people with the people who want to have, strip shows in front of children. They always try to make you sound like you're talking about a much more sympathetic group than you're actually talking about.
Yeah. On the point of just, horror stories about catch and release stuff, Nancy Rommelman is a writer and a journalist, and she does a lot of reporting on Portland. And she wrote a very long story, I think in the last 6 months, about a situation where a guy was beating his girlfriend or wife, I can't remember, and he kept getting let out and kept getting let out. And there were these charitable organizations who pay people's bail for them. And that organization,
Kamala Harris is a noted donor.
Yes.
The Biden-Harris administration is a noted donor of these during the 2020 riots.
And he ended up killing her, which is the predictable thing that we all knew was going to happen. But I agree, the collapsing by the woke orthodoxy of the equating the 12-year-old with capital murderers is so disingenuous. But I can tell you, there are those I've heard this said, that there are no evil people, just very sick people. Like those that cannot be the same thing. This collapsing, because then it's like, and look at how this was constructed in this case, is now this Neely guy is not a violent criminal. He's a mentally ill person experiencing homelessness or houselessness or whatever, unhoused person. When he's someone that, if you just looked at his rap sheet, you should be pushing for max sentences if you're a prosecutor. Like, mentally, this guy does not need to be on the streets assaulting people in New York subways. He just doesn't. And to say that that's a function of mental health, fine. Let's be more sympathetic to that. Let's try to get people treatment. Let's try that. But in the end, this person is a violent criminal and he should not have been on the streets.
Yeah. Well, and the other part of this, I try not to just spend all of our time on the show pointing out the hypocrisies of the woke orthodoxy, because you just get into like, what if the races were reversed? And you do that to the nth degree.
That debate is stupid.
Right. That gets very old. And I'm not going to do that on today's show. I'm not going to talk about what if the races are reversed. I pretty much always try to avoid that on the show. But the interesting hypocrisy to get into is to speak more to the disingenuousness of this, like, there can be no losers. Don't put anyone in jail. You know, let's use mental health services and save everyone. If somebody's sick, the implication rather of being sick rather than evil is that they can be cured, right? This can be fixed through non-violent and non-carceral means. But the same people who tell us to take violent criminals, murderers, rapists, and rehabilitate them, always do it when the criminal belongs to one of their sacred marginalized groups. Yep. They do not do it, and this is getting a little bit into if the races are reversed, but I'll take it a step further so it's a little more interesting. It's not just about, oh, if the criminal was white, then they wouldn't have this much sympathy. It's about the level of offense. So, to bring this beyond just the what if the races were reversed, the same people who say this think that you should be canceled, fired from your job, become permanently unemployable if you say that, you know, Caitlyn Jenner, or I forget the name of the deputy secretary of health.
I forget it. Yeah.
One of the if you say that Dylan Mulvaney is, I need an example of a trans person, so Dylan Mulvaney comes up. If you said on Twitter that Dylan Mulvaney is a man, then these same people who tell you that, oh, the murderers, the rapists, these people who are mugging and robbing people constantly, they should be treated with kid gloves. They should be given mental health services. They should be saved from themselves and from their trauma. Mm-hmm. The same people will say that someone else who just says something that goes against their orthodoxy should face a fate that is worse than at least brief stints of incarceration, to be permanently unemployable, especially if you have children.
I mean, I know I've seen in the UK, I'm sure in the US, I mean, kill TERFs is not an uncommon phrase.
Yeah, absolutely. The violence that, these are the same people that, punch a Nazi, punch a TERF. They want to commit acts of violence against, and of course, a Nazi in this case is somebody who disagrees with them politically.
Right.
It's the idea, these same people, if you have someone on the street who, let's say, is having a white man having a mental health crisis, says the N-word, the big no word that you really can't say and haven't been able to say, for several decades, that person, it would be like, beat his ass, beat him up. Yeah. And it would be completely justified. There's videos all over the internet of some white kid, and there's never any context for these. You never actually see the kid say the N-word, but it's always like, black kid confronts white kid for saying the N-word. These things will pop up on Twitter from time to time, and the black kid punches the white kid in the face. And all the comments are about how fun and awesome this is, that somebody committed violence over words. But again, and I guess this does get a little bit into the what if the races were reversed thing. So apologies to the audience for kind of touching on this a little bit, but I try to go a little deeper than that. But it just speaks to this deep, deep hypocrisy, and it shows how you shouldn't take the argument seriously. Nobody would have supported any of this crap as recently as 2013. This is just like gender ideology. Everyone agreed, super predators, whatever you want to call them. You can't call me racist for saying that, because then Hillary Clinton is racist too. Super predators.
There are people who agree with that too.
Yeah, repeat violent offenders are they're the worst we have to offer as a society, and we don't have time to help them. We don't have time to save them. It is not our concern. We have so many problems. Why would we give so much resources and time and attention to the worst people in our society? And again, this is not based on race or class. It's based on people's behavior. I don't care what skin color someone has. If they're a repeat violent offender, black, white, Asian, Latino, doesn't matter. They belong in the ash heap of society. We don't have time to put them anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no idea. I mean, I guess we've pointed out that it's disingenuous, but then there are some people who I think are good-hearted people who are going along with this to some degree. But I just want them to realize, I hope people don't have to get mugged by reality, right? Like, I don't want somebody to have their hair pulled by, a homeless junkie on a subway, or, have trash thrown at them, or get mugged, get punched in the orbital bone like the 67-year-old woman that Jordan Neely assaulted. I hope that doesn't have to happen for them to realize, oh, I don't care about these people. I'm not sympathetic to them. And you end up in some really bizarre situations where, like, now there are all these stories where some white kid gets murdered by a black person, and the parents are like, I pray for and forgive the person who murdered my child. And there's clearly some kind of demoralization taking place where people just don't want to acknowledge, like, no, fuck this evil person, throw them in the ash heap of society. We've lost our ability as a society to say this person is a loser. They lose. They go to the bad place. I don't know how else I can make it clearer, but it's very important for us to insist this upon our society in order to build the kind of accountability culture for the worst people in our society, in particular, who need to be held accountable, in order to build that culture as we so desperately need to.
Yep. And you're just pointing out that the reductive nature of identity politics really does reveal its idiocy. Because it's a highway that only has one lane going one way. If you're a marginalized person, you are a victim, even if in whatever situation you were maybe the aggressor, because you're the aggressor because you were the victim originally. It's just, I almost, and this is me being cynical, I almost think people have gotten dumb, that they believe that, like, because it's an easy theory, right? It's like it's a dumb person's theory is, well, everything that a black person does that's bad, that's because they were treated so poorly, so they're a victim. Like, that's such a simplistic, reductive way to deal with the nuance of the causes of violence, of criminal violence. I don't know. It's infuriating how reductive it is, and I think it's cases like this show it.
It's infuriating, and it's reductive, and it's also convenient. It is so convenient because what is clearly lying underneath all of these attempts to reduce everything to the black person has to be the victim, the white person has to be the aggressor every single time. In movies, everything follows the script of no man can ever teach anything to or disempower or overpower a woman anyway. These scripts that we follow, they're designed conveniently, out of convenience for the viewer, to not have to confront harsh truths or inconvenient truths, such as the fact that if you're talking about the girl boss example from all the films that we're now being subjected to and have the pleasure of watching or being subjected to, the inconvenient truth and the harsh reality is men are stronger than women physically. They have different traits than women on average. And then, of course, getting back to the topic at hand, though, which is more about race, there is an inconvenient truth that black people commit more crime than white people, proportionally speaking. And you can get into the reasons for that. I don't claim to be an expert on this topic, but you can get into the reasons for that. But to simply deny it on its face and deny the fact that black people, particularly young black poor men, you can really reduce it to a very specific group, poor young black men, they commit an incredibly, proportionally speaking, it's an incredibly high amount of crime. It just is. I think there's a statistic, something like 1 in 5, young black men is convicted of a felony at some point in their life. This is extremely unusual for most other ethnic groups, including other minorities, Latino and Asian people. It's uncomfortable. It makes me a little uncomfortable to talk about it, but people use these scripts as a crutch to not confront those truths. And what we're experiencing now with what's happening with Jordan Neely, who never should have been on the streets, and with the crime waves all across the country, to borrow a quote from the show Chernobyl, it is the cost of lies. If we don't face these truths and we lie to ourselves constantly about the reality, because it is uncomfortable to talk about young black men, young poor black men, in the context of their overwhelming criminality compared to other groups. It is uncomfortable. I understand why it's uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. I'm just like everybody else in this country. It makes me uncomfortable to talk about it. But if we don't confront that uncomfortable truth, then we end up where we are. That's how we got here. And so the mental mechanisms that you're talking about, Ben, that people use to avoid telling the truth about these things, they come from a place of convenience, from a place of wanting to maintain the comfortable worldview that everyone is equal and nobody is worse than anybody else and everyone can be in the same place in the hierarchy. This utopian idea that nobody's really evil, people are sick or they're poor, and we can fix it. We can fix poverty and mental illness, and then there will be no more crime. It's so convenient, and I wish people would be more onto it. I wish they would realize that, I mean, this is accountability culture too. You're accountable to yourself and your society if you constantly build your worldview around what's convenient and what's cozy. There's a lack of accountability there. And you will eventually get mugged by reality unless you live in a hole, in a little hobbit hole, and hide away from the world your whole life.
Yeah, well, Scott, you're saying that this is a complicated issue, but according to AOC, it's not. And so, because we're kind of trying to button up here, so I'll explain to you why you're wrong here. She tweeted, "I've yet to hear a real explanation from any official hesitating to condemn the killing of Jordan Neely about what makes condemning this violence so complicated. Killing is wrong. Killing the poor is wrong. Killing the mentally ill is wrong. Why is that so hard to say?" So that's our leaders, that's our elite class telling us that all of these conversations we want to have about the difficulties in American cities, the difficulties of personal interactions with those who are mentally ill, the difficulties of the criminal justice system and how to handle that. All of it's not complicated because killing mentally ill people is wrong. Thank you, AOC.
Yeah, but remember, according to AOC, why Neely was kidnapping children, punching elderly people in the face, that's very complicated. We really need to think about mental health and the complications of mental health and poverty when we're talking about that stuff. But in terms of what happened in this kind of murky situation, the most of the evidence of which we have of it is a grainy 3-minute long film of somebody in a chokehold. That's simple. Who even needs a court of law? Because as far as AOC is concerned, she clearly wants Daniel Penny lynched. She called him a murderer. She's now opened her up to a potential defamation lawsuit if he should be acquitted of a murder charge. And it sounds like he might, I mean, according to what you were saying, Ben, and I would generally agree with this based on my somewhat limited understanding of criminal law, probably can't even be charged with murder. He would be charged with maybe some kind of manslaughter or reckless homicide. Again, it's hypocrisy on top of hypocrisy on top of hypocrisy. The solution to it, which I always try to talk about on the show, I kind of was talking about earlier. I guess I want to ask you, Ben, because this is what I always kind of come down to on these things is like, how do we get the suburban moms, the voting blocs that decide what happens in this country, suburban moms and other folks, the middle class and the working class who outnumber the wealthy, rich elites by quite a lot. How do we get people to stand up for themselves? I mean, there was just an election famously a few weeks ago in Chicago, coming off of the mayorship of the famous, oft compared to Beetlejuice character known as Lori Lightfoot, who, had famously some somewhat soft on crime policies that have led directly to a large increase in crime in the city of Chicago. Chicago went left after that. They had the choice between two candidates. One candidate who was known for there was a guy named Paul Vallis who was running for mayor of Chicago, of America's third largest city. And you might have already seen something about this. He was actually very pro-police and got something like 48% of the vote. And so 48% of Chicago is going to suffer from the fact that 52% of the city voted for a guy named Brandon Johnson, who is a police defunding advocate. He is a member of I think like the Chicago or maybe it's the county board of commissioners in Illinois, the Cook County, right around Chicago. And he is like a teachers union lobbyist or something, and he supports defunding the police, and he gets elected mayor over the pro-police candidate by 4%. After years of massive increases in crime in that city, New York did a little bit of a better job with Eric Adams, who is a much more pro-police candidate than some of his counterparts. But there are other cities that continue to have anti-police, soft on crime policies, district attorneys. The fact that Alvin Bragg could be elected the district attorney for Manhattan, despite the fact that he wants to like legalize crime, just like across the board. Sure, you have a situation like, let's put it this way. We have an example of what it looks like when this goes right. Chesa Boudin. Chesa Boudin was the district attorney of San Francisco. He was recalled and got his ass dragged out of office by the voters of San Francisco because he legalized crime in San Francisco. Yeah. And he just was not enforcing the law at all in San Francisco. And was replaced by a more tough on crime candidate. How do we get the people, the suburban moms, which I mean, I guess when you're talking about cities, you can't talk about suburban moms, right? That's the complication. How do you get America's cities to stand up for themselves and elect more of these Paul Vallis, and I forget the woman who replaced Chesa Boudin, Eric Adams, elect more of these candidates who can maintain some degree of order? And by the way, to Eric Adams' credit, he released a statement that was significantly more measured than AOC's statement, and where he said he wanted to hear more information, which is what you should do in a situation, instead of opening you up to defamation lawsuits by calling Daniel Penny a murderer. How do we get cities to stand up for themselves, like the people of San Francisco, to their credit, for as much as it's easy to make fun of San Francisco? How do we get more people to do what San Francisco did and throw these district attorneys and these mayors out of office, and to acknowledge the fact that we need to be tough on crime? I know it's kind of a taboo, but there needs to be more Rudy Giuliani's, at least if you're talking about early 2000s, late 90s Rudy Giuliani, who cleaned up New York City in a big way. You need more of that and more of Eric Adams and less of this Chesa Boudin nonsense. And I think that the district attorney in Chicago, her name is Kim Fox, who famously dropped the charges against Jussie Smollett as well. How the heck do you get urban voters? This is the specific question, I guess. How the heck do you get urban voters to protect themselves, as Chicago utterly failed to do a few weeks ago? I mean, in a big way. And I think Chicago could become the next San Francisco based on what I know about their mayor-elect, Brandon Johnson.
Running down the list here. Eric Adams' kind of neutral comment does make me believe that he probably knows more than we do. I suspect that there's a lot more information that's coming into NYPD and to Adams's office than what we know about, which I think is probably what's underlying that. You brought up San Francisco, and that's the note I wrote while you were talking, is what went right in San Francisco, because it was a completely unlikely place for someone like Chesa Boudin to have been recalled. I'd be curious, and I unfortunately think I know the answer, is San Francisco got really fucking bad. Like that, and I would have thought Chicago's that way. I mean, is there a weekend that goes by that you don't see about the record number of shootings on a holiday weekend in Chicago? Like, that's national news. And I don't see how that's not penetrating into the residents of the Loop or wherever in Chicago. Like, how is that not? Is it just loyalty to the Democratic Party / hatred of the Republican Party? Or, I mean, Chicago, you're a one party, or Chicago's a one party city anyway. So maybe that's it. I do have a suggestion, though, that is not serious. I just think everybody needs to get way more online. Everybody just start letting the YouTube algorithm fly and see what happens. Because I say that jokingly, obviously, but there is, in some sense, people who just don't see it. I find it hard to believe, but there's just people who do their jobs every day. Maybe they don't have to go past the homeless person masturbating on the sidewalk. You know, they have normal lives, and maybe that's it. Maybe it's just not having blinders on. I really don't know how you couldn't be awake to these types of things, and I guess until it just gets too bad, which maybe is what happened in San Francisco. But if there are strategists out there, people with more resources than me, I'd say figure out what happened in San Francisco and make a model that you can apply to other cities.
Yeah, this is something I would want. You know, if Ron DeSantis is trying to brand himself as the competent culture warrior, if he could start a movement across the country, obviously there's only so much he could do even if he was elected president, and there's certainly only so much he can do as the governor of Florida, but just as a national figure, I would hope someone like him, or maybe it's Chris Rufo, whoever, starts a movement to recall pretty much every district attorney in the top 20 most populous cities in the United States across the country, and to at least make them face the voters and have to face their own record. I know in Seattle, this has been a huge problem. In Los Angeles, in New York, in cities all across the country, there's just been zero accountability for district attorneys and mayors. By the way, I think there is a recall movement in New Orleans, which is now the homicide capital of the nation, against their mayor.
Yeah.
So you're seeing it in some places, but some national
was
figure,
incredibly corrupt.
Yeah, who's incredibly corrupt. Just an awful, awful mayor. There's video of her, as I recall, like flipping off constituents during like a carnival cruise or something. Just like very bizarre stuff going on in New Orleans, which is now the homicide capital of the nation. It wasn't anywhere near that 10 years ago. But in any case, there needs to be a national movement for accountability of district attorneys and mayors. Mayors often appoint the police commissioners. They have a big impact on this stuff. There needs to be an accountability movement that does, as you said, replicate what happened in San Francisco, which hopefully is a city that will begin to heal a little bit as they start to enforce the laws more. It might take a generation after the amount of damage that's been done, but there needs to be a national movement. And to speak to your note about people just kind of having blinders on and not seeing it, there are people who make the argument, including people like AOC. There's just been people making the argument that like this stuff is just part of being in a city. I remember Seth Rogen got into a Twitter spat with the vlogger Casey Neistat, because Casey Neistat was like, fuck, somebody broke into my car and took my laptop and my wallet. My car windows are all smashed. And he was venting about this on Twitter. And Seth Rogen is like, I've lived in Los Angeles for 15 years, and this is just part of living in the city. And I don't know if he said it like that.
The impressions on this show are just so spot on.
He literally responds, though, with like, this is part of living in an urban environment. He's like, this is part of living in Los Angeles. Seth Rogen said something like, that's happened to me 3 times, and I just live with it. Which, by the way, Seth Rogen, who's probably worth something like $25-30 million, I'm just going to guess, maybe more, probably more. He's a pretty big movie star for a while there. So he's probably worth like $40-50 million, if not more. What an incredibly out of touch privilege thing. You know how big of a deal it is for people. And by the way, Casey Neistat also doing pretty well for himself. He's a huge vlogger. For a normal person to get their car smashed and their laptop and their wallet stolen it's beyond an inconvenience.
It's a disaster.
It's a disaster. It would fuck up your life for months, if not years, for something like that to happen. And the attitude of Seth Rogen seems to be the attitude of all these people on Twitter, whether it's AOC or whoever, saying like, hey, homeless people acting erratically is part of urban life, is that these people are your neighbors and you exist around them. And it's like, no, it's not. It wasn't for 20 years. Again, during most of my lifetime, you could go onto the subway. I live in a major city, believe me. I could go onto the subway without dealing with this as recently as 3 years ago, right before COVID. And then the George Floyd thing happened and the police started getting defunded and disempowered all across the nation. And then it became a problem. Who would have thought? But it's such a crazy argument that needs to be completely discounted and not debated, by the way. There can be no debate over what is the acceptable amount of disorder in a city. It's like, you know what? As close to zero as possible. That's the answer. As close to zero as possible. Is it zero? No, of course not. There's going to be disorder in cities. That part is true. But the idea that there's some that you just kind of, you let it slide. No. Broken windows theory, baby. We learned this in 1995, the year I was born, in the mid-90s. We learned that if you don't enforce the laws on the turnstile jumpers and the erratic homeless people who may not actually be physically attacking people, but they're threatening people and they're acting erratically, if you don't enforce those laws, disorder is what you get. And the consequences of disorder are events like what we saw in New York, where a man is dead who probably should have just been in jail, and another man is going to be charged probably with a very serious crime, when really he was probably either on vacation or just going about his business or whatever, a 24-year-old who served this country and who stood up for the people around him. Again, not knowing all the details of what he might be legally liable for, his initial action was pretty clearly motivated by the fact that he felt that there was a significant serious threat to him on this train. And this is what we get for allowing disorder and going along with the crazy ideology that we've been talking about on today's show. But we've hit an hour, and we're going to talk more about these issues as they continue to crop up. This case is not going to go away. I do think Daniel Penny's probably going to be charged with something. We'll give more updates as that happens. By the time the show comes out, he may have already been charged. We'll see. But in any case, I appreciate the audience, all of you being with us today. This is the Veritas Podcast. If you're listening on iTunes, please leave 5 stars. It spreads the show to more people. It spreads this message to more people. So give us 5 stars and follow us on iTunes and other audio platforms. If you're on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us what you thought of our conversation today. And we'll see you next time on the Veritas Podcast.